N-O-N-U-N-S, the N-O-N-E-S nuns are really on the rise. These are folks who don't identify or affiliate with a Christian church. And they're especially on the rise, we know, in younger generations. So we talked about the fact that we don't really know all the things that are motivating these folks, and there's a lot of diversity within that category of nun. But what we do know is that in contrast to 1 or 2 generations ago, a lot fewer people have those strong ties to church institutions that they would have 50 years ago. So yeah, that's one big thing we talked about last week. Anything else that comes to mind for you? Yeah. 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 So we talked at the end of the class, and this is sort of where we're picking up today, about this story that we've told in my field about Protestantism in the United States. So most of the Christians that aren't Catholic, we group under this heading Protestant. And oftentimes in my field, we've structured a big story. I called it like a kind of a divorce, right? And we talked about it with William Jennings Bryan and the Scopes trial, that after that, evangelicals marched one way, kind of the conservative branch, and the mainline or liberal Protestants marched another way. But part of what I actually want to do today, and what I started to do last week, is even to complicate that story a little bit, and to say that the mainline, which we've sometimes called liberal, actually wasn't only liberal. It was a big tent, and it was kind of an unwieldy big tent, a tent that was so big it was hard to hold together. So you would have found within the mainline, we'll talk about this today, kind of folks all over the map, politically, theologically, geographically, racially, all the above. And that's both, well, this is part of what we want to talk about in this series, is there's both perils and promise in that. And I want to talk today, I think it'll draw out a little bit of a sense of both of those things, what can be hard and what can be really beautiful about having that kind of big tent. Anything else that we want to lift up that you're thinking about from last week? I mean, one of the things I would just say, I started with this, is just the importance of the past for present day believers, not just for history buffs, right? But for everyone. We're all historians, and there's some really important insights that we gain from studying the great cloud of witnesses that has gone before us, both the things that they got right and the mistakes that they made. We can learn from it all, and that's what I hope we can kind of do today. Today I want to talk about this big tent mainline of the 20th century and its involvement in American public life. And as you can imagine, public life, it's not a new thing that Americans have fought over public issues. This is an old thing, right? It goes back to the very beginning of the nation. And part of what I want to do, though, because I do think things have changed over time, is call attention to the nature of the fight in the mid-20th century. I'm going to talk a little bit about a variety of different issues, but I want to really focus on civil rights, the kind of classic civil rights movement, and the way that mainline Protestants navigated that movement. Part of what I sort of mean, I guess, when I think about the perils and the promise, as I said, and as Pastor Stephen reminded us, I mean, the thing that really held the mainline together, this big tent group, and when I talk about mainline, just in case you weren't here last week, I'm talking about kind of the big Protestant denominations. So Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians. I mean, there's a number of groups, and we'll see today, sometimes, and to some extent, a number of the historically Black denominations in the U.S. have been a part of mainline organizations, and that's been really significant. One of the things that's true, these Protestants have been brought together both by a desire to witness to the unity of Christ's church, and so in that sense, kind of for evangelism, you might say, right? And also, as Pastor Stephen said, kind of for the betterment of society. Those are the two things that really brought folks together. And part of what I want to pay attention to today as we think about this theme and how it showed up in the mid-20th century, especially around the fight for civil rights, is the extent to which they were able to pull that off. The extent to which these mainline Protestants managed to pull off both witnessing to the unity of Christ's church and fighting for a better society. And I think that there's a mixed message there, but we can kind of get into it and see. So you may be familiar, let's see if I can do this week better than last week, probably not. No, I'm already off to a bad start. What am I doing wrong here? I'm pushing the button and nothing is happening. Any idea? Am I pointing in the right direction? The light is on this thing, but I don't know if it's. Oh, there we go. Okay. Many of you may be familiar with Martin Luther King Jr. and his very famous letter from Birmingham Jail. Are you familiar with this? You heard of it? You know it? One of the most important texts in American 20th century, political, theological writing. I mean, it's a profound reflection on kind of the meaning of Christian faith in the midst of political and social turmoil. King, in the course of this letter, he's in jail in Birmingham, and he writes out a longhand letter of response to 8 white leaders in the South, mostly Christian. I think there's one rabbi who had, in the midst of the movement in Birmingham, criticized the approach that King and the civil rights movement around him was taking. Basically, part of their message was that King and the movement needed to be more patient, that they needed to be willing to take smaller gains rather than the big breakthroughs. And so King in jail in Birmingham responds to these folks. And I think there's pieces of this that are really relevant for our conversation. He famously says, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. And he goes on and he says, and this is a direct quote from the letter, I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan. So these are kind of the radical anti-Black folks, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by what King called the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a, quote, more convenient season. King ends that part by saying, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. He goes on in the letter, and this comes right after this criticism of the quote unquote white moderate, to say, he says, let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. I've been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. He goes on to say there's some notable exceptions. And he names a couple of folks who would fall into that category. He says, but despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say that, this is interesting, as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protests in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. So King is in jail in Montgomery and is frustrated. And his frustration is an old frustration in Black Christian communities. It goes way back. How many of you have heard of Ida B. Wells? I love to teach about Ida B. Wells to my students. I always tell folks that if you don't believe in the Holy Spirit, you need to read about the life of Ida B. Wells. Because Ida B. Wells, such courage, such vision, such faithfulness. Wells was a young believer grew up in Mississippi in the time of the Civil War. She went on to Memphis. Her family tragically died during a yellow fever epidemic breakout in Mississippi. She moves to Memphis. She's a young teacher there and gets involved. She's very, very pious, regular churchgoer, loves to visit lots of different churches around the city. And she's a real ferocious critic of preachers in terms of their preaching. She's like, oh, he wasn't a good preacher. He was a good preacher. If you go through Ida B. Wells' diary, lots of criticisms of preaching. She had a very strong sense of what good preaching was. I would have been really afraid if she walked into my church, I think. But Wells, she's a remarkable woman. She gets to try her hand at journalism in Memphis as a young Black woman in the late 19th century. And then in 1892, one of her best friends in Memphis, who taught Sunday school with her every week, was lynched. And Wells knew for a fact that he, like so many other Black men who were lynched in the late 19th century, was not guilty of what he had been accused of. And she was a unrelenting investigative journalist, and she just started investigating all of these claims. And she became, in the 1890s, one of the most famous international critics of lynching. And Wells, part of what's so remarkable to me about her, I mean, her press was destroyed in Memphis immediately upon her kind of telling the truth about what had happened. It was destroyed. She was sent into exile. And she spends the first years of her exile going everywhere around the United States, and then finally to England, looking for white Christians who will say a simple, basic truth that you can't kill, murder innocent people. Lynching has to stop. She said, why is mob murder permitted by a Christian nation? She got no traction in the United States. That's why she went to England. She believed that if she could go to England and kind of raise consciousness in England, that maybe that would put some pressure on Christians back in the United States. And she did raise consciousness in England. And in England, they're saying, what do you mean that the white Christians of the United States won't do anything about this? And it didn't work, though. The pressure didn't actually work. So she comes back to the US, goes back out on tour. She's speaking everywhere around the country, trying to get folks just to show up, even to hear this message. And there's no response. Wells kept going her entire life. She's become more famous in recent years as an unrelenting advocate for civil rights. What people don't often talk about is she was an unrelenting advocate for civil rights straight out of her Christian faith. And it was no source of, honestly, disappointment, frustration, and sometimes despair for her that her fellow believers in the US would not rally to her side. So King, when he's talking in 1963, is drawing on this long sort of well of frustration and disappointment and still also hope, though, that maybe there is something deeper in our identity as Christians that might move people who otherwise have not shown up how we might hope folks would show up. Both Wells and King, I think, to the end of their lives, embodied both that frustration and that hope. And I want to talk today about kind of what happens in the 2 years after King writes Letter from Birmingham Jail, because there's actually some significant change. So I want to come to that, but I want to just sort of briefly lay out in about 5 minutes here, because I've got a lot of ground to cover today. Why? I mean, where does this alienation come from? Where does that sense of separateness come from, right? Why is it that people didn't show up for Ida B. Wells? Why is it that King encountered such opposition? I mean, part of the reality, and I think for Presbyterians, Protestants more broadly, for white Christians, we have to wrestle with is the fact that in this country, and even before the founding of the country, Christianity has been deeply, deeply tied to racism. And in fact was implicated in the kind of earliest emergence of racism. I mean, part of what's so interesting, I love teaching this material. I wish I had 3 hours today. I'd go into much more depth. But part of what's so fascinating to me is that racism hasn't always existed in the way that we now know it. It comes to be, and it's created in the 17th century, and it comes in part out of slavery. Slavery comes first. Racism comes second as a justification for slavery. And white Christians who most white Christians coming out of the Reformation, they wouldn't have called themselves white because that's a racial category that didn't exist in this way at this time. But they had believed coming out of the Reformation that you couldn't enslave fellow believers. So part of the long story, and we can come back, and if you have more questions about this, I'm happy to go into more depth, but I just got to move fast at the beginning here. Part of what happens in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 16 and 1700s, is that Christians change their own theology and their own practice in order to accommodate slavery. That's part of the deep background of where this frustration comes from. Part of what we know in the 19th century across the United States and in England, you get the emergence of a world historical abolitionism movement. And abolitionism is a really big deal because for most of human history, people had found ways to justify slavery in different kinds of forms. So, I mean, race-based chattel slavery, like it emerges in the US, is a different thing, but there's a longer human history of finding that slavery could be something that moral, faithful people would be involved in. And so in the 19th century, when you get radical abolitionism, saying slavery is always evil, slavery is always wrong, it's kind of a new thing. And part of what historians of abolitionism would tell you is in its earliest years, it's really coming out of a kind of radical reinterpretation of Christianity, led in many cases by Black Christians who found in the message of Christianity, they found in Christian faith a God who wanted them to be free. And they found this in the Exodus story. They found, right? And they pick up on these threads. Part of what, again, this is a much longer story. I'm just going to breeze over it and I'm happy to answer questions. Part of what we know is that most white Christians in the 19th century didn't join abolition movements. There were two big camps in white Christian America in the 19th century. There was a pro-slavery camp, and there was a anti-slavery but not pro-multiracial democracy camp. So that's Princeton Seminary, actually. Princeton Seminary was in the camp of people who said, we don't think slavery is good, we think slavery is immoral, but we don't believe free Black people can be equal citizens of the United States. And so we helped to found Liberia in Africa. And that was kind of the enlightened, reforming white Protestant was let's eliminate slavery eventually and then send Black people back to Africa. That was kind of the reforming view. The abolitionists were seen by most white believers as heretics because the Bible, it seemed, and this is Mark Knoll wrote a wonderful book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, in which he shows that most white Christians in the US came to believe that the Bible was on the side of the slaveholder. And so they couldn't join the abolition movement because they cared about the Bible. Black people didn't read the Bible in the same way. And some white Christians didn't either. And that's where abolitionism comes from. But the reality, again, it makes sense in the longer scheme of things, right? If we're thinking about where does this alienation come from, it partly comes saying, until the South changes, we're gonna hold its feet to the fire. Part of the story and part of the tragedy of that period, right, which is a period of radical possibility in American life, the years right after the Civil War, part of the tragedy, part of the devastating reality is that multiracial democracy that's being born in the post-Civil War South is crushed. Again, long story, people write long books about this history, but it's crushed in part through a campaign on the part of mostly white Christians who wanted to quote unquote redeem the South. And they considered it, they used that term, the redemption, quote unquote, of the South was to destroy kind of the multiracial democracy that was coming to be born. Okay, this is the deep background for the story I want to tell you today about the Mainline and the fight for civil rights. Part of the story, I ended last week by introducing this organization, the Federal Council of Churches. Federal Council of Churches is kind of the embodiment of these two big hopes that mainline Protestants had in the 20th century of embodying Christian unity and embodying a fight for a more just, a better society. And it's founded in 1908 to advance those goals. This is a huge organization that includes most Protestant denominations in the country. So all of the kind of major white, they would have called themselves evangelical churches, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, some Baptists. But the Federal Council, this organization that kind of is the institutional embodiment of mainline Protestantism, includes all these smaller denominations too. Some of the Quakers, the Reformed churches, the Moravian churches, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and the National Baptist Convention. So it's got these historically Black denominations that were founded, many of them with the exception of the AME in the wake of the Civil War, along with all of the major white Protestant denominations. It's a big tent, okay? And that's part of the setup. So in 1908, when the FCC is founded and the country is in the throes, the multiracial democracy that had started to be born has been crushed. Jim Crow is a reality really across the nation. Across both North and South, you have a lot of segregation and separation. But the FCC in its own institutional ranks represents a much bigger tent. Now, it wasn't a tent without limits. One of the things that the Federal Council, and this goes with its desire to be a witness or to kind of evangelize, it required all of its member denominations to affirm Jesus Christ as, quote, divine Lord and Savior. So the Unitarians really wanted to get in, but they were never allowed in. The didn't believe in this kind of ecumenical project, ecumenical meaning, that belief that even whatever our differences may be, that there's some value in working together. Some denominations, the Southern Baptists never got on board with that. Some Lutherans never got on board with that. Many Pentecostal and holiness churches weren't interested in this kind of cooperation. But the reality is that most Protestant denominations in the United States at this time were a part of this big tent experiment. The structure of this organization. So this is, again, you don't need to know everything about the Federal Council, but the main thing to know is this is the way that Protestants are going to work together to show the love of Christ and to work for a better society. This is the organization that they build to do that work. And the committee structure, many mainline Protestants, we love committees, lots of committees. The committee structure reflects that. There was committees within this organization to work on everything from literature and education, temperance, family, Sunday observance, foreign missions, home missions, peace and arbitration, relations with Japan, the church and country life, the church and social service, and a commission on evangelism. So these are all the kinds of things that this organization is trying to do in the 20th century US. And not everyone within the organization was equally excited about all of those committees, right? Some people were like, I'm really invested in the evangelism committee. And I kind of am only okay with like some of these other ones, right? But there was enough there to where everybody could find something. And everybody, could find something to hold on to, something that they believed in. From the very beginning, the Commission on Social Service was the controversial one. You don't need to necessarily be able to read this, but what you need to know is that at its founding in 1908, the Federal Council adopted what it called the Social Creed of the Churches. And it sort of laid out in broad strokes some of the things that it wanted to fight for. So it wanted to fight for equal rights and complete justice for all men in all stations of life. This is a very, you hear the all men is very 1908. For the abolition of child labor, for such regulation of the conditions of toil for women as shall safeguard the physical and emotional health of the community, for the suppression of the sweating system, sweatshops and the like. So it laid out a variety of things that they're not too specific. They're not, but there's things that in general, all the Protestants involved in this thing could kind of get behind. Part of the promotional materials for this organization, for all these, the mainline Protestants, they laid out some of what they hope to do. Together, the churches allied for a great task, kind of rebuilding America, rebuilding American communities, and some of the things here, right? Women in industry, social hygiene, church community house, colored churches, child welfare, studies in special industries. So part of what it sees as its role is to speak to what it means to love our neighbor. Okay, that's really hard. Really hard. I think we can all talk right now about how differently people can think about what it might mean to love our neighbors. And it's always been hard. This organization sets out at the beginning in 1908 to do this work. Okay, I'm going to skip some because I want to get right to civil rights. So let me skip around here. Okay. So I think that the civil rights movement puts the organization to the test in a way like no other issue. And I think part of what I want to bring it to your attention today, and what I want to make it the focus of this session, is that it really does underscore the promise of a big tent, as well as some of the challenges. So in 1946, the Federal Council of Churches became the first predominantly white organization in the United States of America to condemn Jim Crow, issuing a statement in which it, quote, renounced the pattern of segregation as unnecessary and undesirable and a violation of the gospel of love and human brotherhood. And the organization moreover pledged to, quote, work for a non-segregated church in a non-segregated society. This was a bombshell in 1946 for an organization that had members across all the nations, Southern Presbyterians, Southern Methodists, Northern Baptists, all across the map. You have an organization able to come together and renounce the pattern of segregation, became the first predominantly white organization in the country to do this. So we think about King's letter from Birmingham Jail and the frustration, right? It's a big deal that the Federal Council is able to make this statement. And the reality is in 1946, when it makes this statement, it reflects decades of painstaking work in community by folks like Benjamin Mays and George Haynes, who are Black leaders within the FCC, along with some kind of select white allies. Thelma Stevens was an ally in the Southern Methodist Church who worked tirelessly to see that the organization could do this thing. It was remarkable in part because the Federal Council included lots of people who liked Jim Crow. That's how big the tent was. Lots of folks who were invested in Jim Crow were a part of this organization, which is why when this statement is passed in 1946 condemning Jim Crow, the leading Black newspaper in the country, the Chicago Defender, proclaims Jim Crow and the church were divorced this week by the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America. And truly, in the wake of this statement by the FCC, a bunch of other Protestant groups, the YMCA, it really sends, this is part of the deal with mainline Protestants, right? They've been really important. So when the mainlines folks do something, it has echoes, it has reverberations. And this statement in 1946 had huge reverberations across the nation. Now, the headline in the Chicago Defender that these things are divorced oversimplifies things a little bit. The reality is that the FCC is trying to hold this big tent together. And there is a lot of awareness on the inside that there are a lot of people on the inside very unhappy with this statement. And so their promotional materials continue to downplay this strong criticism of Jim Crow. And the reality is the fight would go on. So, I mean, give me just a few minutes to kind of give you a few examples of this. So you think 1946, we condemned Jim Crow, now we're moving forward into the bright future. One of the struggles of the Big Tent, right, is can you do anything? Can you do anything? Because sometimes, depending on how you navigate the Big Tent, if the idea within the tent is we got to get everybody within the tent to agree, sometimes you can never do anything. But if you do something, does the tent get smaller? Do people leave the tent? Do people walk out? This is the challenge, right? Can you build a big tent that's not paralyzed in response to God's call to be faithful? That's the challenge as I see it historically and today. Can you build a big tent that doesn't end up paralyzed and unable to be faithful? And part of what I think is required inside a tent that's big, where you want to still be able to do things, is trust and love for others. That sometimes you're not going to get your way inside the tent, but there's some greater value in staying inside than marching out the door. And it's a struggle, because sometimes some of the things that we fight about are really important, and they really hit close to home for us. And it would just be easier to walk out the door. This was the struggle of the federal council in the 1940s and 50s as civil rights mobilization is picking up around the country. So 1946, they make this big statement. 1948, there's another call for a statement around kind of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They want a statement that would declare that human rights, quote, cannot be obtained under a system of racial segregation. The council had vehement objections to this statement on the part of the Southern Presbyterians, who didn't like this statement at all. They did not want to say that human rights could not be obtained under a system of segregation. And so after much discussion, there's a decision, we're going to move forward and we're going to vote, and we're going to outvote the Southern Presbyterians. But then a Methodist bishop from Pennsylvania makes a last-ditch parliamentary intervention. Love Mainline, love our parliamentary procedures. Makes a last-minute parliamentary intervention attempting to refer this statement that would say segregation and human rights are incompatible to the executive committee, where it could forever be tabled. And seeing the writing on the wall, a Black minister from Gary, Indiana, stands up and says, most of you, so he's in an overwhelmingly white room here, Black minister from Gary, Indiana, near where I used to live when I taught at Valparaiso. Most of you do not know the horror of having money in your pocket, being unable to buy food, or being sleepy and not being able to find a place to sleep. Huge cheers, renewed resolve. Parliamentary maneuver thwarted, and the statement passes. So the organization decides, hearing the words of this Black minister from Gary, we're going to outvote the Southern Presbyterians and some of their allies in other parts of the country. That's a hard decision, right? There's a lot of pain there. There's the potential for a break in relationship there. I think this is an interesting example of both the perils and the promise, right? It's the fact that the Black minister from Gary is on the inside of the tent. He would not have been on the inside of very many tents like this, even in the 1940s, but he was on the inside of this tent. And so people on the inside of the tent could hear his voice, and his voice led them to make a hard decision, a decision that would continue to create challenging relationship dynamics on the inside of the tent. 1952, the National Council of Churches, which is the successor to the Federal Council, wants to adopt a statement on the churches and segregation. And Southern delegates again tried to stop the adoption of this statement for obvious reasons. They're invested in segregation. So again, the tent's really big and it's really unwieldy. They want to stop it. But also inside the tent, promise of a big tent, is Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church. So in Harlem, one of the most historic Black Baptist churches in the nation, pastored by Adam Clayton Powell. seeing the writing on the wall, votes to secede from the FCC in protest of this move. He says, how can we expect, this is their minister, Adam Clayton Powell, how can we expect the legislators of America to be more Christ-like than their clergymen? He says. That same day, 75 African Methodist Episcopal pastors met in New York City and passed a resolution demanding that the National Council move forward with this statement on the churches and segregation. And once more, a strong version of the statement passed. See the struggle. You see the dynamics inside of Big Ten, right? And that struggle, can we maintain some level of trust and relationship when you have the most vehement disagreement about the most difficult issues of our time? Sometimes it didn't work. So one of the challenges with the Big Ten, right, is that you end up paralyzed. You can't do anything because you're so worried about making everyone feel okay in the moment that you just can't do anything at all. In 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy, was tortured and murdered while on a visit to the South from his home in Chicago. And the National Council of Churches could not even muster a strongly worded statement. Couldn't muster a strongly worded statement because there was enough sentiment within the institution among mainline Protestants that it was wrong to publicly criticize the verdict of a jury. And so they don't make a statement. There are, I think, perils of the Big Ten. I mean, most people would look back on what happened in 1955 to Emmett Till and say, how can we not cry out, right? But sometimes we don't cry out because we get caught up in the dynamics of a Big Tent that can be both beautiful and can also lead us astray. Part of what's cool about the story, this is an article about Abyssinian Baptists and their activism to try to get the statement passed, is that the National Council of Churches doesn't just pass statements. So in the 1960s, as the movement's picking up, even as King's in jail in Birmingham and in the years immediately following, part of what happens is the National Council gets really engaged in fighting for breakthrough civil rights legislation. In 1964 and 1965, you may know, the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, these were major breakthroughs that were the product of broad coalitions. It's a big story about, you know, how you build a big, broad coalition on the national level. But partly what they did, sort of the National Council fought tirelessly for these bills. And it did it, again, out of a conviction that this was part of what was required of mainline Protestants in the mid-1960s if they wanted to witness to the love of Jesus Christ for the world. For them, for many of the folks who fought for these pieces of legislation, it was for evangelism and for a better society. It was a way of carrying out this chief mission. And part of what they did is help in places like Indiana and Iowa, where far from places like Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, the leadership of the National Council made a difference, convincing folks to vote yes on these major breakthrough pieces of legislation. So part of the big story, right? If you think about King's frustration in 1963, and you think about this long history of white entanglements, white Christian entanglement on the wrong side of civil rights issues, that really is part of our longer history. Part of what, to me, is the promise of a Big Tent is these kinds of breakthroughs are possible. So when you draw up a big enough tent that you get enough different kinds of voices in the room and you really listen, you never know what God might do when you listen to all the voices in the room. And I think you can find in the history of the federal and the National Council of Churches around civil rights, coming out of a history that, as we look back on it, you know, there's a lot there that we have to lament, I think, as believers in that longer history. It's coming out of that longer history
amid a lot of social and political turmoil, that these mainline Protestants are getting together and they're trying to figure out, what is God calling us to do right now? And gosh, they had a lot of conversations about that. And gosh, they were hard. They were really hard. Part of why the conversations worked to the extent that they did was because of the variety of voices in the room. Again, that Black minister from Gary isn't in most rooms like this, right? God can work in a big tent. But the danger, and depending on how you construct your tent, right, is that the driving concern becomes keeping everyone inside the tent happy at all times. And that's not God's call on our lives or our communities. And the question, I think, for those of us who find ourselves in big tents is, what do we do when some of our fellow believers are feeling called to act boldly, faithfully, in response to God's call, when we don't agree? Do we walk out the door? Or do we find a way to hang together, to continue to voice our own views, to continue to speak out what God is saying to us, but to hang with and to hang in, hoping and believing that God is at work on the inside of this tent and calling us not just to keep a negative peace, as King called it, right? But to fight for a positive peace in our wider society. It's a really hard thing to do. Part of what, I think the story, the main upshot today, and I've got 10 minutes today for questions, I think, so I want to make sure to leave plenty of time because I've covered a lot of territory. One of the big upshots today, today for me is a day of celebrating the promise of a big tent, because I do think part of the big story here is that the federal and the national council churches, these big mainline organizations, were able to take huge steps forward out of a history with a lot of tragedy. They were able to do something. And I think in a way that we look back now and we say, wow, I'm glad they did that, even as hard as it was. And I think they were able to do it because of the size of their tent. It was a big tent. But if you can already hear today in sort of the story of today, the struggle with keeping a big tent together, next week, I want to talk about how really tough it can be and how really tough it can be. So as we come back together next week, I want to move into this next era after 1965, when the tent really buckles a lot under the pressure and the strain of disagreement. And I want to think together again about what does it look like to stay faithful inside that tent, even if it's buckling a little bit. Let me stop there. I got a lot on the table, so let's talk. And what questions do you have? What are you wondering about? What do you want to know more about? What do you want to talk about? Not just with me, but maybe with each other. Yeah.
So I'm Jeff.
Jeff, yes, thank you.
I'm looking at this picture, Marching for Justice.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going, there are people who are applauding Black people and white people working together.
Yeah.
Oh, look, we've got Black people and white people working together.
Yeah.
And look at the picture. Black people are on one side of the table.
Yeah.
The white people are on the other side of the
Yeah.
table. And it just underscores the incredible difficulty of leaving your comfort zone.
Yeah.
To go over to the other side of the table.
Yeah.
When we serve meals to the unfortunate people. The people who we were working with, who were part of the leadership of the people serving the unfortunate people, would say, please, when you have lunch, don't sit down with yourself. You're comfortable. Ann and I sit down, have our sandwich together, get over and sit with Dan Dominich. Because Dan's on the other side. And that is the hardest thing. They're working for justice. They're working together. But they're not together.
Totally.
They're not.
That's hard. These things that we know, right? Like social class and race, and these things are real things that really give us different experiences of the world and make it hard, even when we really want to connect. It's hard to. Sometimes, in my own experience in those kinds of situations that you're talking about, it's hard to know, like, what do we talk about? right? What are we going to talk about? I mean, that can be really hard.
Or you can be afraid of,
Yeah.
be afraid of that other person's misconception about you. So
Yeah.
you approach
Yeah.
and you feel like perhaps you can judge before you speak.
Yeah. This is one of the challenges with building bigger tents, right? Is that it's much easier. And this is part of, I mean, this is what we talked about last week, right? There's a reason why. I mean, I was reading this morning. I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff on polarization this fall. Not just within churches and whatnot, but just even geographically, we are more and more separated from people that disagree with us. So I learned this today. It's at 900 people per square mile, maybe it is, or something like that. That less than that, and a place is likely to be Republican. More than that, and it's likely to be Democratic. And it reflects, like, even within counties, depending on how dense a part of the county is, people are separated, and people are flocking and more flocking to be like the people that they already agree with. It's easier, and it's. I mean, in that sense, it can be nicer, right? If you're hoping, it's much more pleasant to just be around people that already agree with you. Every time you say something, be like, oh yeah, I know. Much harder if you're like, oh, I don't know what they think about this. That's tough. It's tough. Yeah. What other things? Are there other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
So I'm Beth.
Yes. That's.
So you talked about the power that the National Council of Churches
Mhm.
had during that period
Yep.
after the 60s and stuff. But
Yep.
parallel to them deciding to take bold steps
Yeah.
is any of their actions, other than individually where you're
Yeah.
standing at a table putting meals together,
Yeah.
kind of thing, impacting anything when you also have a government, which at that point in time was Big Tent
Yeah.
Johnson,
Yeah.
democracy stuff, who has their own issues and all their own games playing that you need in order to have the power that the National Council of Churches is trying to bring forth impact.
Yeah. I mean, part of what I guess the story I want to tell today is that this kind of setup that the National Council's like painstaking deliberations through these things are not just for the churches, though they are for the churches, but they have a big impact on the nation. And I mean, these pieces of landmark, I mean, this is some of the most significant legislation of the 20th century, of all of American history, to be honest. And it comes in part because it's not a sense of, oh, this is legislation that, I mean, in American politics, the reality is you can't get anything done outside of a coalition. And so part of what I think, one way to think about what the National Council does is it expands the coalition of people who say, yeah, I'm for civil rights. That coalition had not been able to get traction in earlier generations, but they do in the 60s, and it's a big deal for the nation. Yeah.
What about that, Vicky? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What about the fact that we have a whole issue with immigrants,
Yeah.
and the immigrants are mostly brown.
Yeah.
They're not,
Yeah.
and people have, well, we don't want them because they're from Mexico, Guatemala, or whatever. I don't know, they have a political issue.
Yeah.
Combined with the issue, and
Yeah.
that seems hard to
Yeah.
fit into the whole circle.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the many issues that divides believers, divides Americans today, right? And I think part of what I guess I'm lifting up this historical case study, not because I think it's an interesting one, but also because I think it does represent broader dynamics that I think can be at work on any given issue, right? I mean, if you could imagine, what if Christians today could get into a room with people that disagreed, and what if there were also immigrant or refugee voices in that room that could speak in the conversation? A lot of those folks are also Christians, and what would it look like to be able to build a tent big enough to where you could hear all those voices and deliberate together about what God's call on us is? I don't think we're doing a lot of that right now. I think we tend to have those conversations in spaces where we already agree. And we often don't hear the voices, like in the case of the Gary minister, right? Of the people who are going to be most directly impacted. And that does seem like something, there's another study, but there's a lot biblically about listening to those voices. Jesus certainly listened to those voices, and so how do we make sure we're hearing those voices? Yeah, remind me your name. Yeah. Marina, yeah.
I don't want to be discouraging or anything.
Yeah.
Just listen to this and think to myself, I wonder if it would have the same impact today as it did then.
Yeah.
I feel like when the churches all came together then,
Yeah.
the voice was regarded as such a voice of morality.
Yeah.
And I just feel like the reputation of the Christian,
Yeah.
not the church itself, I don't feel like it's being regarded in that way today.
Yeah. It's definitely not. I mean, that's part of what I see for you all and for all of us as the stakes of this material fundamentally is, we have not a good reputation at this point, right? And I think that's part of when we talked about last week, like what's driving the vast, speedy rise of the NONESs, the nuns. It's probably this, that where there's a little bit of a scandal around Christian public witness. And that's why I think if we could figure out how to be more faithful and to model a different way. I mean, I think sometimes it's like, we just sound like clanging cymbals in a larger chorus of clanging cymbals. Do we just sound like the rest of our society? We divide predictably, we show up predictably, we treat each other predictably. What would it look like to model a different kind of way? And could we rebuild and carve out again? I mean, I guess for me, as I think about the nuns, part of when I see the nuns, I think a lot of those folks are just waiting to be inspired. They're not like atheists and they're not anti-Christian necessarily. They're just people who are like, I believe in God. A lot of them are like, I think Jesus is my Lord and Savior, but I don't really see why I should go to church. It's not really feeling like there's a lot there for me. So I wonder, again, for your congregation, for the larger picture, like, what if there was something there? People were like, wow, something different's going on there. I mean, that is, again, where the old vision of the FCC was that vision. It was partly like, hey, if we work together in a way that's compelling, that'll be a great witness. So I guess I want to say, you're totally right. We haven't been doing a great job of this, but I think that's why I am going around talking about it, because I think there's a real opportunity for us in the midst of the clanging cymbals to sort of be different. What if we were different? What if we found ways? What if you all found a way to be different in the way that you are with one another and the way that you engage the community around you? That would be cool. I think we're out of time. Are we out of time? Okay, let me end there, and I'm happy to stick around and talk about it. Let me just close this with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for your presence in this congregation for hundreds of years. We thank you for your presence here today. God, we know that we live in a society with facing so many challenges. And God, we pray that we would be able to learn from both the faithfulness and the mistakes, the sins of that great cloud of witnesses that's gone before. God, help us to be a witness to your love and to your life here in this place and in the communities that surround it. Amen. Thank you all so much. Look forward to next week. Yeah. I'm happy to chat. If you have more questions, want to talk more. There's a lot to say. Lots to say. And great to see you. Yeah, it's basically there was just like a bunch of information. The Southern Presbyterians, they kind of like